Hello and welcome to Art Talks in the Bainbridge Arts and Crafts Gallery. My name is Deborah Rosinski. I'm Executive Director here, and it's my pleasure to present two artists today. We're starting with Roberta Wagner, who has a piece in our current show, Fresh Talent, and she brought lots of materials to share her process and inspirations and approaches, and we're very happy to have you.
Thank you, Deborah. And thanks to the gallery, and thanks for having me. This is a beautiful show that's up, and I enjoyed looking at it myself because there's so many different mediums that were used by the artists. So please interrupt me if you have any questions. I'd love to be interrupted instead of just talking, so interrupt me if you have a question. But I thought what I would talk about is I was interviewed by an Australian fiber arts group a while ago, and the interviewer asked just a great question. She said, "What is it that inspires you? Is it ideas or is it materials?" And I just blurted out, "It's materials." And then I started thinking about it more, and I thought, well, you know, I wonder if that's really true, because ideas are really important to me too. So I thought I'd talk about some of the ideas that do inspire me. And one of them is this idea of big vistas, the horizon that you can look out and, you know, just see for long distances. I'm a little nervous. It feels kind of odd, so bear with me. But anyway, so I'm from Minnesota originally. I've lived in Gig Harbor for 20 years, but both of my parents were connected to the Dakotas. And I remember driving with my dad through the Dakotas, and he would point at some stand of trees that's 60 miles off and just be delighted that he knew it was that far away. And I think that's part of what gave me that love of the horizon line. So big views. And then conversely, I love really close-ups. So, you know, if you look at the bark of a tree, it's almost like looking at an abstract piece of art. Or, you know, when I walk along the shores of Puget Sound and see a seawall there that has moss and rust, and you can take little fragments of it, and it's like a piece of abstract art. So I love those big views, and I love the close-ups. And I don't almost never work in between, in the literal. So I never have people in my work, I never have houses, I never have anything that's concrete. I guess once in a while you can see a garden leaf or something, but that's about it. So I brought this book because this is one of the times that I first started loving the close-up. It's a book I found in New York a long time ago in a used bookstore. And this photographer took pictures under high magnification of gemstones. And each one after another, is just beautiful. So I'm happy to pass this around if you'd like to look at it. And, you know, kind of that far out and that close up. So the same thing is true of the Hubble telescope photographs. You know, it's that same thing. And I guess what I love about those two, the far off and the close up, is that it's like an unseen world that is there around us all the time. And that's really a big part of what inspires my art. So that's quite abstract in many ways. And I really do love abstract art. Most of the time, my work has a reference to the land or the landscape or something like that. So there's a reference to something. But, you know, I think the first time I really fell in love with abstract art was a retrospective of Helen Frankenthaler's in New York. And, you know, you can walk around and her color is so beautiful. You don't need to think about what does it mean. It was just like I entered those paintings and became the color for a while. So to me, the abstract and lots of color is, you know, just something that will always inspire me as an idea. And then I also love the idea of layers. You know, it's like that unseen kind of magical world between microscopes and the Hubble telescope. There's a whole unseen world. I mean, there's so much of me you don't see. There's so much of you I don't see. There's so much of what happened on this ground before. I mean, think of 10,000 years ago in this spot that we're standing in. So when I lived in Virginia for a while, we lived on a property that had seen Civil War battles. And I'm sure I felt that in the land, even though you couldn't see remnants of it anymore. So I brought one piece to kind of illustrate. This is so this is a whole bunch of different materials, and I call it terrains because there's many, many layers of fabric and stitch and paper. It's a whole bunch of different stuff in here. So we can pass this around too, it won't get hurt. And there's a lot of stitch on it, machine stitch and other stitch. And so I just brought that as an idea of the layers. And then movement of any kind. I was recently in Minnesota and visited one of the native prairies in Minnesota, and the grasses were swaying, and just the movement of the grasses on the prairie was so beautiful. And then, of course, on Puget Sound, watching the water move and the waves and the way the color of the water changes based on the way the wind and the light is. So that is always inspirational to me. So one thing I do in my studio to kind of warm up in the day, at the beginning of the day, is I do movement pieces with India ink. And some of them I like. This is one I actually like. But some of them I don't like. It kind of tells me what my mood is for the day. But it's a way to start moving big instead of, being small with some of the stitch work that I do. So here's one I don't like, kind of confused, and some days I like that. And, here's some others that I like. So I often wonder if there won't be a time when I start integrating these big movement pieces more into my work than I'm showing. Probably, because I do love it. And then the kind of the opposite of that, or a different feeling, is the very meditative quality of stitching. So I love that idea of having big movement and then the stitch. It's a little like loving the big view and small close-ups. And then because I think of growing up around the Minnesota cornfields, fields often come up in my work. So in this piece, there's little remnants of the idea of fields. And it's very abstracted, but I think that sometimes when we grow up in a place, it seeps into us more than we even realize and comes into our consciousness. So those are the ideas that inspire me. But remember, I blurted out that it was materials that inspired me. So, and I think the reason for that is I make all of my own materials that I use. And so once I've got the materials that I like, then I can figure out how I might want to work with them. So I brought one piece that I'm working on to give an example of that. I haven't figured this one out yet. I'm still working on it. But there's 2 layers of organza silk. And then this is painted linen. It's a linen that I just love with acrylic ink on it. So I can pass this around too. It won't hurt it. There is a needle in it, so be careful. But, so the thing that I love about that is there's a lot of texture in it. And I worked with clay for 30 years. And so clay has that wonderful texture and three-dimensionality to it. So if I'm just painting, it feels a little too flat to me. So by being able to incorporate texture in a piece always feels really important. And then color is really important to me. So another thing I do in the studio when I'm not sure what I'm going to do is just take a red, yellow, blue, and do color studies. Because when I used to paint, maybe 30, 40 years ago, sometimes I wouldn't be able to get to the color I wanted. I didn't know quite what did I use exactly to get to that color that I was mixing. So by doing this, it helps me when I don't know what else to do in the studio to just kind of learn what colors are going to do when you mix with them. And then I have a record of it and can go back and come pretty close. I'll know what was the blue and what was the yellow that I used to get that. Okay. And then, pardon me?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
So the first thing when I looked at this piece, I just was struck by the color palette. It's just so beautiful, and I'm just wondering, how you decide on a color palette?
Yeah, I don't actually decide. That's a really good question. I have a whole bunch of materials, and this particular piece, they just happened to, there was gray and rust sitting there, and I thought, oh, that looks really good. And then I went to start looking for other grays and other, some black and some other rust colors that would go with it. But for the most part, I don't, when I'm actually assembling a piece, I'm not thinking about a color palette. I'm thinking about color when I'm making materials. So that really comes, let me show you a couple of the papers and things that I use. So I love washi paper. It's a Japanese paper with long fibers in it, and it's really tough, and it takes ink beautifully. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of washi paper, and I've tried a whole bunch of them. This particular piece I painted on this side, but this is the side that I love. And so I didn't know I was going to be doing yellow and orange on that. Just came out that way. But then I also do a lot of botanical dyeing. And I do it for two reasons. Here's a piece of art paper that looked like this originally. And I layer leaves and other things and put a bunch of weeds in a dye pot and cook it for a while. And it makes it soft, and it frays the edge, and you also might get a little bit of a leaf there. And it, to me, is so much richer than a piece like this, which, kind of goes to that Japanese concept of wabi-sabi and not wanting it to be too perfect, wanting things to be a little torn with torn edges and things that aren't perfect. That's a good question, though. Yes?
Could you spell that Japanese concept for me? You said wasabi?
Wabi-sabi, it's W-A-B-I-S-A-B-I. There's a lot being written on it now because it really has to do with the idea that all of the life cycle is wonderful from the birth to death. And so things that look old and are dying are beautiful or can be beautiful too. It's part of it. So, and so then I also talked a little bit about inks. Thanks for that question. I also talked a little bit about inks because I really love inks, and not only the India ink, but the Birmingham Ink Company makes some beautiful organic inks. And I've started making my own inks. So this year I made some Queen Anne's lace and some Madrona ink. And the Queen Anne's lace was a beautiful yellow. I think I have a piece of some of that in here. And the Madrona was kind of a rust brown. So you cook it a lot longer, and then you strain it, and it makes a beautiful ink. And there's lots more that I want to try. And kind of along that line, I do a fair amount of botanical dyes. Now this is organza silk, and you can see the leaf pattern. I think that was a hydrangea leaf. But I don't actually, like I said, oh yes, Deborah.
Sorry, I just had a question. It's interesting that you're making your own inks, and I'm wondering how that process differs from maybe making dyes, because I've heard a lot of people making natural dyes out of plants, but not ink.
You have to cook them longer. You cook them longer, so because you want to boil it down so it's more concentrated. It's a related process, although with making inks, you can use different materials than just plant material. Like you can take drywall, the inside of drywall, and work with that to make a white ink. And white inks are kind of hard to find, so there are people that are writing about how to make inks now, and it's an interesting process if you like to do botanical dyeing anyway, which is getting popular. So this was botanically dyed, and with a hydrangea leaf, and I think I dipped the hydrangea in a little bit of iron, and then cooked it in a pot that I like to take a lot of weeds from my garden and cook them down and see what color they're going to be. So I'm getting better at telling what color the weeds will turn out. But that's probably what I did with this. I don't use this as a leaf, but because like I said, I don't usually like things too literal. But you can see that you can layer the organza silk on top of the paper. So that terrains piece that you mentioned has lots of layers in there. And to me, even though we don't see the actual material, we feel it when we're looking at a piece. So, and as part of the botanical dye process, this is just kitchen parchment paper. But I will often put it in the dye bath because I love the feel of it. And in fact, I did a series of pieces on the tidelands of Puget Sound where this layering, you can kind of see where, especially if you mix it with some of these papers, where's that one? Like this edge of the paper, it starts to feel a little like a tideland receding. So, there are some of those papers. Then I have a lot of rice papers. I was talking to, we were talking about how hard it is to organize a studio. So I have bins these are my blues and greens. So, and there's bins for browns and blacks. And I mean, you end up with really a lot of stuff. And so when you were asking what color palette I use, all of the pieces are made. And then I'll kind of say, so if I want to start working on a new series, I'll pull out all of the materials that I think I might use, and my studio becomes a complete mess. And but juxtapositions can be seen that way, and it might be a color palette that if I had been trying to rationally come up with it, I wouldn't have been able to do it. So these are some rice papers, and this particular rice paper here is one that I bought years ago. And I could only get 3 sheets of it at the time, and I guard it with my life now because it feels like fields, and so it's a good paper for me to use. There's some of it in that terrains piece, and then I do a lot with textured fabrics. So this is one of those pieces of linen that I've painted with acrylic. I think a really watered down acrylic. And again, I like the pieces that I can layer so that they'll start layering. And there's linen and cotton and more silk and more organza silk. And so lots of different materials. Would you like to see some of them? Should I pass them around or not? Okay. I don't know. Here, I'll just share a few. So I did bring one other piece that I'm working on right now to kind of give you an idea of that. So this is that washi paper that I just love. And there's 3 pieces of China rice paper that have been attached with a matte medium. And now I'm trying to decide what to do next. Do I want to layer something behind here? What kind of stitch would I like to do on it? But I'm so in love with the paper and the way these pieces are coming together. So a lot of times when I'm doing something like this, I have to let it sit for quite a while. So it just adds to the confusion and the chaos in the studio, and then I'll find something that I'm not thinking about that I put on there. So I'm glad I've calmed down a little. Thank you for the questions. Let's see, what else was I going to say? Okay, so, and then of course I use threads. So here's some of my yellow threads. And, I've been collecting threads for a long time. Like this thread now, I would never use. It's way too harsh. It was a chemical dye. I don't know, maybe I'll find a use for it, so I haven't thrown it away or given it to somebody that would like it. But what I do like now are these quite thin cotton Danish flower threads, they're called. And they're organically dyed, so I like that. And I do like organically dyed silk threads. And I am starting to dye a lot more of my own threads because they kind of go with the papers a little bit better, and I don't need to have so many of these threads. And then, after making clay for so many years, originally when I started doing this, I would add beads. But I found the more I worked with them, that they're too regular for me. They're too round. And the 1920s beads that are cut glass beads are wonderful. And I do like those. So if I can find those, I'll use those. And otherwise, I've started making my own little pieces. I usually use porcelain and just make little things that I can attach to a piece. Some of them have the field pattern most often. So those are kind of the materials that I use. And I actually thought I'd show you. I'm going to just dump all of this on the floor for a minute. I thought I'd show you kind of what I do. Oh, I was going to show you this piece too, which this is part of a series of 5 hanging pieces, scroll pieces, that you can see the machine stitch is the black thread. And then there's a lot of hand stitch. There's paper and fabric on all of the pieces, so they're very layered. And I like the way they hang away from a wall and cast a shadow. So I'll show you this one too. And those were mostly inked fabrics. So I thought what would be kind of fun though is going back to that question of how do I decide on a color palette. I'm not sure if I can do this in front of all of you, but I think I can. So I don't throw away many scraps. So I have so many of these, it's ridiculous. So a lot of times what I'll do is just dump them out and see if there's a way that I could put some of this together in a way that I might like. And, like here's a start even, where there's just some layers and then I can attach them with, and I usually like to add even more, so there's another piece that kind of fits in there. And so I make a lot of these little pieces. It's kind of a way for me to warm up in the studio. And I have a lot of these that are in process, and then I have to look at them for a long time and see, now, do I really like that or not? And I think I brought one little one here. Yeah, here's a little piece that was done that way. So it's upside down. I'll take these out of your lap there, so you don't have to have them. So, and I had a friend of mine who's actually the CEO of a bank come over and was showing her these pieces, and she said, I could give up banking to do this, because it is really fun to look at the pieces and just see how they might go together. So any other questions? Yes?
Another question. When you're working on one of these pieces, how do you know when it's finished?
Boy, that is such a great question for any artist. I don't always know. It takes me a while. I usually keep a piece in my studio for at least a month and keep looking at it to say, do I really think it's done? Does it say something that feels important to me, or is it just kind of an interesting design? So, and I have gone too far sometimes, because I do like things very serene. Like this piece is really serene, and I do like that. And this particular piece started with, I was painting some bronze paint on paper, and thought that I was going to like it. I was getting some interesting textures and stuff, and then when it dried, I didn't like it anymore. And I don't like to throw away good paper, so I started just playing with gesso and white, and then that I really liked, and then could add the newsprint collage to it and start thinking about, okay, so what does it say to me? So I actually work on a piece like that a fair amount of time. Once in a while it'll come together just like that and it's done and I know it's done, but. So any other questions?
I like how you talk about your warm-up. Do you have, in a given day, do you have a regular routine, or you go, today I'm going to do the movement pieces, or?
I wish I had a regular routine. It's a great question. I wish I did, because I think it would be better for me. But a lot of times I have a piece that I started the day before, and I'm really anxious to get back to it. Or I just got a shipment of new papers in, some Korean Gampi paper and some other papers. I'm so excited, I can't wait to try them. However, there's also a lot of days that do I really feel like doing anything today? And that's when I like having some things that I can turn to then, so that I still stay connected to my art. That's a good question. Well, thank you very much. It's been fun. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roberta.
Oh, you're welcome.
Be sure not to miss the Fresh Talent exhibition featuring 30 regional artists, all of them new to the gallery, at Bainbridge Arts and Crafts from October 1st through October 31st.